The gavel came down on $85, and Buell Garrity laughed before the sound of the wood had even finished. It was the 9th of October, 1961, in Millbrook Falls, Cassidy County, and the crowd standing in the gravel lot behind the old First Agricultural Bank, numbered somewhere near 60. The morning had come in cold, 38 degrees, with a wind that carried the smell of wet limestone off the building's north wall, and underneath it, the sweeter rot of hay gone damp overnight. Somebody's transistor radio played low from a truck bed. Garrity's laugh rolled out over the crowd, and the crowd laughed too, the way a crowd does when the loudest man in it decides something is funny. Elias Thorne did not laugh. He signed the bill of sale on the tailgate of Garrity's own truck, using a pencil stub someone handed him, folded the paper once along a crease already worn soft from other folding, and put it in his shirt pocket, buttoned. The safe sat on a moving dolly between two hay bales, an old Diebold floor model, cast iron, painted black once, and now the color of a dead ember where the rust had worked through. It stood 26 inches wide, 20 inches deep, 24 inches tall, and it weighed 340 pounds, a number Elias knew because he had asked the bank's last teller, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who still remembered the invoice from 30 years back and recited it to him without having to think. Nobody else in the crowd had looked at the hinges. Elias had. He had walked the full circle of the safe twice before the bidding opened, and along the bottom seam, someone had scratched 4 letters into the paint with a nail, so small you'd need to kneel in the gravel to see them at all. W-R-P. Elias had knelt. His knee complained the whole way down and the whole way back up, and he said nothing about that either. Elias Thorne was 71 years old, 5'9", built narrow through the shoulders the way men get when they've spent a life bent over a workbench instead of plow. His hands were the part of him that showed his age plainest. The knuckles swollen, the nails cut close, and always a little gray at the edges from oil and old brass filings. The left thumb curled slightly inward from arthritis that had settled in during the Korean War and never left. His eyes were pale blue, gone a shade lighter with age, and he moved the way careful men move, no wasted steps. He wore the same canvas coat he'd owned since 1958, patched twice at the left elbow with thread that didn't quite match, and steel-rimmed glasses that slid down his nose when he leaned in close to anything small, which was most of the day. He had been a locksmith for 44 years. His father had taught him on a bench in the back of a hardware store in Paducah, starting him on padlocks before he was old enough to shave. By the time Elias was 20, he could open a bank safe by ear alone, listening for the click of the wheels the way another man might listen for a change in an engine under a hood. During the war, he had done it for the county sheriff twice, both times on safes left behind by men who had died overseas, and both times he refused payment beyond the cost of his gas. Nobody called for that kind of work anymore. Combination locks were giving way to keypads, and keypads didn't need a man with careful hands and 40 years of listening. Elias kept a small shop on Coulter Street anyway, because a man does not stop doing the thing he is good at simply because the world stopped asking him to. He had a saying, one his father had given him on that same bench in Paducah, and one he gave to no one unless they earned it. A lock is not a wall. It is a conversation. He believed it the way some men believe scripture. Every safe had something to say if a man was patient enough to sit still and let it. He had bid on the old Diebold, not because he expected riches inside it. He had bid on it because nobody in Cassidy County had claimed it in 20 years, and that fact alone, more than any hope of money, had kept him up 2 nights running, turning the number over the way he turned over a stuck tumbler. Buell Garrity ran the county auctions the way he ran everything else in Millbrook Falls, loud and out front and never once doubting himself in public. He stood 6'2" in a gray silk vest that had never once been within a mile of a farm, a gold pocket watch chained to his belt that he checked in front of people whether he needed to or not, and shoes so polished the gravel dust seemed embarrassed to touch them. He drove a new Buick, the only new car in 3 counties that October, and he made sure everyone in Millbrook Falls had seen him drive it at least once, usually more than once, up and down Main Street on a Saturday for no reason, but to be seen doing it. He made his money buying unclaimed estate lots cheap, then reselling anything with value to dealers up in Louisville, keeping the difference and calling it a service to the county. He had wanted the old safe for exactly that reason, expecting cash or bonds worth 10 times the opening bid, and when Elias outbid him by $15, Garrity turned to the crowd with his watch still in his hand and called him the Tinkerer, loud enough for the back row near the fence to hear it clean. "Nobody in Cassidy County goes by Tinkerer," he said, "unless he's forgotten what year it is. Boy, the whole world's gone electric." The crowd laughed because Garrity laughed the way a crowd does, not because there was anything funny in what he'd said at all. To his credit, Garrity had once covered a widow's unpaid lot fee out of his own pocket. It did not change what he was that morning in the gravel lot. Now, if you have ever seen a man who knew exactly what he was doing get laughed out of a room by a man who did not, subscribe to this channel. Because the people who stay for stories like Elias Thorne's are exactly who Forgotten Vaults was built for. The first agricultural bank of Millbrook Falls had been built in 1919, brick and limestone hauled up from the quarry outside town. The pride of a county that grew tobacco and little else, and had never had much use for a bank until the tobacco started paying. It survived the worst years of the Depression better than most, small enough that its failure stayed small, but it failed anyway. The last week of March in 1941, one of the final small banks in the state to go under before the war, changed what failure even meant. The manager at the time was a man named Walter Pruitt, 40 years in the position, a widower, well-liked around town, careful with numbers his whole career until the last winter of it, when he wasn't. In the final winter before the bank closed, Pruitt had foreclosed on the Colson family farm, 160 acres 2 miles north of town along the Cumberland Fork, on a debt the Colsons swore up and down they had already paid in full the previous autumn. The paperwork on file said otherwise. Nobody in town thought to question a man 40 years in the job. The bank took the land in February, in the coldest week anyone in Millbrook Falls could remember, and the Colson family moved into a rented house on the edge of town with what they could carry. Pruitt sealed the safe himself on the last working day the bank ever opened, a Friday, and told the 2 remaining tellers he needed a week to sort the final accounts before the examiners arrived. He never came back to open it. 3 days later, he was found dead of a heart attack in his own kitchen, sitting upright at the table with his coffee gone cold in front of him. And whatever he meant to do with what was sealed inside that safe, he took the reason with him into the ground. 20 years the safe sat in a boarded-up building nobody in Millbrook Falls much wanted, through a war and a Korean conflict and a decade of quiet after that, gathering dust and the smell of an empty building that no longer had any reason to be locked. Elias had known Walter Pruitt slightly in those years, had cut a spare key for his back door once in the spring of 1938, and remembered him only as a quiet man behind wire-rimmed glasses of his own, the kind who checked his own work twice before he'd sign anything at all. Elias loaded the safe himself, refusing 3 offers of help from men half his age who meant well and would have talked the whole time, using a hand truck and 2 lengths of pine board laid down the bed of his truck like a ramp. It took him 40 minutes and left him breathing hard, his shirt damp through at the back despite the cold. He drove the 11 miles home at 22 miles an hour, the truck's springs groaning under the weight on every rut in the county road, the October sky gone the color of dishwater by the time he reached Coulter Street. Word had beaten him home. Ruth Calloway had already telephoned 3 people, and a boy on a bicycle followed the truck the last quarter mile just to see where it was headed. He backed the truck to the garage and left the safe there overnight, untouched, tarp thrown over it against the damp, because a man does not rush a conversation he has waited 20 years to have. He began the next morning at 6, before the sun was properly up. He turned the radio off. He pulled his stool close, set a single bulb hanging bare from the rafter, and laid his tools out on a folded towel the way his father had taught him 57 years before, picks on the left, oil on the right, rag in the middle, nothing touching another thing until it was needed. The first attempt told him nothing at all. The wheel gates had rusted into a single frozen mass somewhere behind the faceplate, and the dial would not turn past 4 numbers before it caught hard, like a bone set wrong. He sat back on the stool, wiped his hands on his trousers, and admitted to himself, quietly, that he might have paid $85 for nothing more than a very heavy box that would sit in his garage until he died. He worked a thin, penetrating oil into the seam around the dial spindle, 3 drops at a time, and left it 2 hours, going inside to eat a plain breakfast of eggs and toast and read the paper without taking in a single word of it. When he came back out the dial, turned a quarter-inch further before it caught. Progress, but not yet an answer. The second attempt, closer to 9 o'clock, brought him 3 of the 4 numbers, found by feel the way his father had shown him on that bench in Paducah, listening for the small drop in tension as each will found its gate, a sound smaller than a watch tick, felt more in the fingertips than heard in the ear. His shoulder ached from holding one position too long. His glasses fogged twice in the cold garage air, and he took them off and wiped them on his shirt tail both times. He kept going anyway, because 3 of 4 was not 4 of 4. And he had learned a long time ago that the last number is always the one that costs you the most. The third attempt was the true obstacle, a bent contact, somewhere deep in the mechanism that refused to seat no matter how gently he turned against it, and it cost him past noon and into the early afternoon, his hands cramping every 20 minutes, his bad knee complaining every time he shifted his weight on the stool to relieve his back. He nearly quit twice. A neighbor leaned in the garage door once to ask if he wanted help, and Elias said, "No thank you," without looking up. Both times he nearly stopped, he thought of the 4 scratched letters on the hinge, W period or period P period, and he stayed on the stool. At 2:17 in the afternoon, by the clock on the workbench wall, the final tumbler dropped with a sound no louder than a single coin set down flat on a wooden table. Not a bang, barely a click at all, the kind of sound that could pass for nothing if you weren't listening for it, which is exactly why so few men ever hear it. Elias did not reach for the handle. He sat where he was on the stool, hands loose in his lap, and let a slow breath out through his nose, the way he always did at this point, whether the safe held anything or not. Cold air moved out past the rubber seal, carrying the smell of old paper gone soft with age, dry leather, and something faint and metallic underneath it, like a coin that had been held too long in a closed fist. He sat with it a moment longer, letting the smell settle in the small garage before it thinned out into the cold morning air around him, and only then did he reach down and turn the handle. He removed the contents the way he removed everything from any safe, one item at a time, each one laid flat on the workbench before the next was lifted out, checked twice against nothing but his own habit of checking. First came a canvas bank bag, brittle at the folds and gone gray with age, holding 11 government bonds dated 1938, worth at fair auction value alone more than $4,000, a sum Elias counted once under his breath and did not say aloud again. Beneath that sat a small tin box, rust along its seam, and inside it a woman's engagement ring, a thin gold band with a single chip diamond, the gold gone tarnished nearly black from 2 decades shut away from air. He held the ring a moment longer than he needed to. It reminded him of the ring his own wife had worn before she passed in 1954, and he set it down carefully, the way a man sets down something that isn't his to keep. Last was an envelope, unsealed, the paper gone the color of weak tea and soft as cloth at the corners. Inside were 2 things folded together, a deed to 160 acres in the name of Colson, marked paid in full in Walter Pruitt's own hand, dated a full year before the foreclosure that took the land anyway, and a letter, for pages, dated the same Friday the safe was closed for the last time. Elias read it once through in silence, then again slower, his lips moving slightly the way they did when a thing mattered to him. One line he read a 3rd time, aloud this time, alone in the garage. I foreclosed on a debt that did not exist, and I have not slept a night since. Return this land before you return anything else. He set the letter down on the bench, folded it carefully along its own old creases so as not to add new ones, and sat very still for the better part of 10 minutes, hands resting on his knees, listening to nothing but the tick of the cooling engine block out past the garage door and, somewhere down Coulter Street, a dog that would not stop barking at something only it could see. He did not cry. He put his glasses back on, though he had not actually taken them off, out of habit more than any need, and he went inside to make a pot of coffee because a man has to do something ordinary with his hands after a thing like that, and coffee was the ordinary thing closest to him. Elias delivered the deed, the bonds, and the ring to the county courthouse the next morning, driving the same 11 miles he'd driven the safe home on, and said almost nothing to the clerk beyond the date and the name Colson, spelled once, slowly. He kept nothing for himself. When the clerk asked if he wanted a finder's fee on the bonds, the going rate being 10%, he said he had never been offered one and would have been embarrassed by either. The deed went to Ada Colson Whitfield, 79 years old, the last living child of the family that had lost the farm on a debt that had never actually existed. She had spent 40 years believing her own father had failed them through some fault of his own making. She learned otherwise on a Tuesday afternoon in a courthouse hallway under a bad fluorescent light, as she asked to sit down in the nearest chair before she said anything at all, her hand pressed flat against her chest. Buell Garrity heard about it from 3 different people inside a week, each version making him a little more foolish than the one before it. His estate lot business, built entirely on the quiet assumption that nobody ever came looking twice for what he sold off cheap, began losing consignments within a month. By spring he had left Cassidy County for Louisville, the Buick and all, and nobody troubled themselves much to ask where he'd gone. The old bank building now stands as a small county museum on weekends, and the safe sits inside it still, empty, its heavy door left open on purpose for anyone to look through. Children touch the dial without being told not to, and ask the docent what a thing like that was even for. Elias Thorne went back to his shop on Coulter Street that same week, cutting keys, fixing door locks, saying little, the way he always had, his left thumb still curled the same, his glasses still sliding down his nose. So here is the question worth sitting with. A loud man laughed at $85 and was wrong. A quiet man paid it and was right, and wanted nothing for being right. What would you have bid that morning? And which of those 2 men would you have believed?